Yeah, so I was thinking, as Stanley passed away last week. It was like a day. It was a day before my birthday, actually.
It was the day before your birthday.
There are a few coincidences. My nan passed away this year, and she was exactly the same age.
Oh gosh, really?
Yeah,
What, as you? That doesn't make any sense.
Sorry?
Well, exactly the same age as you. That doesn't make any sense.
No, as Stanley.
I see. Sorry. Yes.
Yes. So she was 95. She was born in 1922 as well.
Yes. Oh wow.
Yeah. So from the outset, I want to say that I have never been like a big comic book fan. I must admit that.
And yet we're friends.
And yet we're friends. It's not that I'm not a comic book fan. It's that I was never, I can't, suddenly put my hand up and say, yeah, I like comic books. I've always liked them. That's not been the case.
Yeah.
I liked 2000 AD.
Oh well, yes, cool.
I didn't buy it religiously, but I bought that a lot, and but I've never, I remember I think we talked before, and I made the mistake of confusing DC and Marvel, which is like you can't do that.
Yeah, I know.
Schoolboy error.
It is a schoolboy error.
But I know that obviously comic books mean a lot to you, especially Stan Lee, and I wanted to ask you a few questions about how those comic books and how I suppose my main question is how influential were comic books, Stan Lee in particular, on your philosophical development?
Yeah, I think they had a tremendous effect. I'm not a formal one. It's not as if I was reading comics for all these years. And you're right. I've been involved in comic collecting and comic reading ever since I was a child. I can't remember. There was never a moment in my life where there was no Stan Lee, where there were no comics and superheroes. It was very much part of my background. And I don't want to give the impression, and it's very easy to do that now, particularly in kind of in a time when popular culture has become something we can mine and something we can legitimate academically, and that there are courses now running on, and quite rightly so, on popular culture and on comics and on film and on all sorts of genre things which would never have been considered before. I don't want to give the impression that was always on my mind way back in the 60s as a primary school kid looking through these comics. So that's a nonsense. These things I think have had an existential impact on me. And I think they do on most people. I think a lot of people, even if they claim to be reading comics, for example, with a view to their high-minded, intellectual, philosophical kind of content, I think, for the most part, people just like the impact. They like the kind of sensory engagement with something very colourful and a good story. In the same way as a meal. I mean, you can sit down and you can say, yes, well, of course, I'm very interested, very concerned about my dietary requirements, and I'm very interested in making sure I've got my calories balanced out, and the kind of and I'm eating things that have a balanced diet, and all these kinds of things, and I'm aware of all these, and that may well be true, but we eat because we enjoy eating. We enjoy the taste, and we enjoy the sensation, and we enjoy the social aspect of eating with other people. And all of that sort of stuff is an instinctive, and it's an existential thing. So I think that's where comics hit me. I can study them, and I do study them, and as you know, I've written on them and taught on them and so on. But when it's me and a comic, it hits me at a tacit level. So I don't want to go away kind of sounding particularly pompous about my engagement with comics. It is very much a personal thing.
Do you still get a kick now in the same way as you did then? Because the reason I say that is because I remember that kind of feeling of getting reading those 2000 AD stories back in the late 80s for me, and it really was, diving into something that was. It was a little bit, it was exotic, a little bit erotic sometimes, and it was very powerful, and it was for me as well. It was it wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't for my family, and that feeling was very strong. But these days, I find it hard to open up the same. I can read the old stories, but the kind of recent comic books, I don't get that kind of feeling anymore. Is it still the same for you?
No, and probably not in the same way. I mean, the current output of the comic industry is very nuanced. There's a lot of it. It's very informed. It's very slick, and that's great. And there's some really interesting stories to be had. But in a sense, there's nothing like your first time. In a way, there's no love like your first love. And also, I think age makes a lot of difference. I mean, growing up in a very small. I mean, I grew up in Jersey in the Channel Islands, as you know. So it's a small island. If our listener is not aware of Jersey, it is a small island off the south of England, closer to France actually. Than
we call them the Channel Islands.
They call them the Channel Islands, and Jersey is the main one of them. I mean, they are very tiny. They're not kind of backwaters in the middle of nowhere, but it is it does have that kind of small. It's insular by definition. So you grew up there, going through the usual things that young people do, kind of trying to figure out their own identity, trying to make sure they don't get bullied at school, coping with, as I did and as many others did, with broken families and being brought up by my mother and so on, all that kind of stuff. And comics, in a sense, provided me with context. They provided me with a community. They provided me, with almost the best of all possible worlds, if you want to kind of coin that sort of phrase. I mean, I didn't have a particularly harsh upbringing compared to other people, and how bad it could have been. But the comics provided me with I suppose it's like any good book or any good film. If a world is created, a coherent world is created, then it draws you in. People say the same for Lord of the Rings, for example. That was a book that really meant something to them, and they really got drawn in. The ability to create worlds, and I think that was one of the things that the early comic writers knew well. The ability to be able to draw and to write a coherent world with people that you could engage with was a really important thing. And I think one of the reasons that Stan Lee and Marvel, or Time Lee as they were back then, are justly renowned for, is they understood the importance of world building, and they didn't make their worlds, in spite of the fact that they filled their worlds with these fantastic beings, and they filled these worlds with these colourful characters. They didn't make the world itself unbelievable. I mean, comics had been going for years. I mean, people forget that when, for example, DC were producing their comic runs, Batman, Superman, these characters were created in the 30s. So Batman and Superman were there, for example, during the Second World War, and you have some very interesting kind of covers of Batman, shooting kind of the enemy on the beach with Robin smiling at his side, and you've got lovely covers of Superman standing there, telling people to buy more war bonds with the eagle on his arm and so on. This was 30s stuff. When Marvel Comics in their earlier stages came along with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who also passed away this year, they had a different view. They tried to create a world where these characters were people you could bond with. So, for example, Spider-Man almost didn't get published because the idea of Spider-Man was what we're going to do is we're going to create a 15-year-old boy, an orphan living at home with his aunt and his uncle, and he's at school and he's not very popular and he gets bullied a lot, and girls don't like him, and he's got spectacles and he's kind of a bit geeky, and the publisher at the time said to Stan, you can't do that. You can't do that. Nobody's going to buy that. What we want is a white male successful professional, because that's what you all are. You've got to be a reporter or a policeman or somebody, and perfectly successful, perfectly well balanced, fairly popular, and he's going to be the hero. So they stuck Spider-Man in a comic that they were going to cancel. A comic series called Amazing Fantasy, and they were going to cancel it anyway. So we'll stick him in there for one issue, and he ended up in Amazing Fantasy 15. Once that comic disappears, we'll never have to bother with him again. Now, of course, Amazing Fantasy 15 is just a ridiculous price to buy now. The whole thing went through the roof. Spider-Man became instantly successful, and he became instantly successful for existential reasons. Yeah. Kids were reading these and thinking, yeah, I'm that guy. Yeah. I'm actually that guy. I'm the guy that can't get girlfriends, and I'm the guy who actually quite likes being at school and studying, but I daren't say that because all the jocks are going to laugh at me, and I'm the guy who constantly gets picked on and beaten up. And that kind of that ability to create a character you can bond with, I think was a major success of the Marvel Comics line then, and it meant people like me as a kid thought, yeah, actually you could, you don't have to be desperately kind of confident to still be, to be a hero. Spider-Man's not very confident. He can't pay his rent. He's worried about his aunt being ill all the time. He doesn't know what he's doing, so he uses humour to hide his lack of kind of control over the world.
So you can identify. There's a really good interview online. Who's the guy? It's Alan Moore is the V from Vendetta guy, right? You have to get the name.
Yeah,
Alan Moore.
Absolutely.
He's being interviewed by Stuart Lee, the comedian. And there's two things that they said that struck me. And the first thing is Alan Moore saying, you have to remember that when the comic books first came to England in the 50s or whenever it was, 50s, 60s, they were like ballast in the ships. They're like almost worthless. That was the first thing. And the second thing he said, he's talking about Stan Lee, and he's like what you were saying. Alan Moore was kind of making a little bit of fun, but in a kind of in a good way, really. But he was saying that you had Superman and the Batman, who are kind of one-dimensional characters, and here Stan Lee comes along with a great grand idea. Let's make them two-dimensional characters. he has superpowers, but he's got a bad heart.
yeah. As with the Iron Man. I mean, it's that I think is true. I think that's true, and it is interesting. I mean, a lot of my the early comics in my collection, things I bought as a kid in newsagents in Jersey, do have water damage. I mean, not that they're kind of torn and manked up, but you can tell that they were stored in a damp environment, and they were literally brought over on the mailboat to the island, if there happened to be any space on the boat, and so you wouldn't get any kind of consistency in it all. But you're right. I mean, there were these kind of fairly one-dimensional characters, and most of the stories were kind of villain of the week, beat the villain up, lock him away, end of story. When Stan Lee started to create his characters, there was an extra dimension added to them. That didn't make them fully rounded, and that has come subsequently, I think. That the characters have become more fully rounded and probably less entertaining in that way, because they, in some respects, if they become almost too realistic, and you can't associate in the same way. If you're going to associate with a character, then there needs to be an element of cipher there. There needs to be an element of the undefined, so you can say, yeah, that could be me. The more precise that character becomes, and the more unique that character becomes, the more you're saying, well, that's them. That's their life. That's not me. I can't associate it in the same way. Now, personally, I think that's possibly the way things have gone. But I remember, for example, and one of the first things that Stan Lee ever wrote for the kind of the burgeoning Marvel line was the Fantastic Four. And he was tasked with coming up with a team, because again DC had already got their team together. They'd created this team called the Justice League, and it was kind of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and so on. And Stanley was told, well, why don't you write a team story? And he thought, I don't want to do that. I want to be a serious writer. That's an interesting. I want to be a serious writer. I don't want to write.
I heard that.
And most of the people.
Sorry to interrupt you. So
go on. Carry on.
So the Stan Lee name was his kind of cartoon comic name. and his
Yes.
real name is Lieber, right? And he was gonna he said that he was keeping that name for the serious stuff. And he wanted to be a serious writer.
And I think we can return to that later, because there's a really important point, I think, to be made there. But he said, well, I don't want to do this because, you know, I want to get into proper writing. I want to write novels and short stories and so on. And as you say, comics, although they'd had a fairly long tradition, they were considered ephemera. They weren't considered to be anything that had any lasting value. You bought them, you give them to kids, they read them, they throw them away. And they were considered juvenile. They weren't aimed at an intellectual market or even an adult market. And it was his wife, Joan. He said to him, "Well, you know, run with us. I mean, make it your own. Do something unique here. You want to write something with a bit more depth to it. Do that here. Show that you can do that." And she kind of urged him on to actually take up the story. And so he wrote the story, and Jack Kirby drew it, of this team. But these were not all particularly pretty people, and these are not all friends. So it wasn't the kind of the usual team of relatively kind of good-looking underwear models. You had a kind of relatively scrawny looking scientist type. You had a teenager who was a bit kind of hot-headed and a bit kind of and kicked off every 5 minutes, like in a kind of teenage tantrum. You did have the woman who, to start off with, the Invisible Girl was very much eye candy. And interestingly enough, her power was to become invisible. And there's a kind of gendered subtext there that, you know, the woman in these things, for quite a while, that their power was just not to be there, if at all possible. And then you had Ben Grimm, who's the Thing, who was just a throwback to kind of the more 1950s monsters comics. He was a very ugly brick-like monstrosity with huge strength, and they didn't get on. I mean, they were constantly kind of referred to. I have constantly been referred to as the first family of Marvel Comics, and like a family, they were constantly bickering with each other. I mean, they were very fond of each other, and they loved each other. And you know, Reed Richards, the scientist, and Susan Storm, they got married, and it was a comic which portrayed the marriage and the wedding, and all the heroes from all over the Marvel universe came to the wedding, which reinforces this idea of a shared world. But yeah, they were not people who were always that always liked each other, and that was another interesting thing. You know, I remember reading it thinking, yeah, just because I fall out with my sister, or, you know, my mum shouts at me or something, that doesn't mean. That was one of the first lessons, actually. One of the first lessons comics taught me, that you can love people and you can be a family and not necessarily like each other and not necessarily be getting along at that time. And I think that was an important thing for me.
I was thinking there. That kind of superpowers relating to their persona or who they are. That is really reflected well in the modern animation, the Incredibles, which is kind of obviously is a throwback to those 50s.
It is.
So you get the little boy who can't stop. You know, he's running around and can run really fast, and the mother who can who's kind of like bendy and stretchy, can do lots of things at once, and obviously the man is like this, wants to be the power of the family. So that it reflects quite well.
You get a lot. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You get a lot of that that sort of thing happening in the popular culture of the time. The idea of various members of a particular group or a particular family representing particular aspects of a single psyche. So yeah, with the Fantastic Four, you've got the kind of the intellectual, the rational Reed Richards, and you've got the kind of the heart of the whole thing, the kind of the empathic side, the traditional role that they tended to put women in, and then you've got the kind of the big, strong kind of hands-on, let's just get this done by hitting things. Character in the Thing, and then you've got the kind of fiery passion of youth with Johnny Storm as the Human Torch, and you get the same sort of thing when looking at something like Star Trek and the original Bridge Crew. You've got Kirk, who was the kind of the impulse, he was the kind of the character that brought all the other elements together. in a way. So you had McCoy, who was the kind of emotional. He always sort of thought with his heart, Jim. Yeah, you can't do this, Jim. You can't do this, Jim. Think of the people, think of the children. And then you've got kind of Spock, who was the kind of the rationalist, kind of you've got to be reasonable about these things, and you've got to be logical about these things. And then Kirk is the kind of the entity that kind of brings the heart and the mind together. So it's often suggested the bridge crew are just kind of one character. And you're just seeing aspects of them in different shirts. And I quite like that. And again, I think that might well be one of the reasons why I've enjoyed that, or certainly as a child, why I was drawn to that sort of popular culture initially, because it kind of helped me make sense of the world. And maybe that was how I began to segue into philosophy, as I began to recognise philosophy as a discipline that is supposed to help you make sense of the world.
At a base level, that's the entire kind of reason for art and culture, anyway, isn't it?
Well, I think that's true. They're always kind of, and what you do, I think, when you're engaging in art, or you're engaging in philosophical speculation, there's always an element of abstraction. You're taking a snapshot. You're never looking at, because you're always stopping time. You're always stopping something in a moment and saying, let's just look at this frozen from this point of view, and just this bit, and see if that can help us make sense. And I think one of the skills one needs, and we've been talking about how in a sense anybody can engage in the philosophical discussions without necessarily having the background or the toolkit. I think one of the abilities you need as a philosopher is the ability to recognise that you are viewing snapshots, you are viewing slices, or you're viewing you're viewing frozen moments. The ability to see all these things and to try and bring them together, to actually fit them together. So although you might be looking at the ethical aspect of the human mind, or you might be looking at what motivates human behaviour, or you might be looking at what how we engage with knowledge, or with information in the world, or how perception can. You might be looking at all these things, and you're freezing time, and you're taking a step back, and everything is seen in a degree of abstraction. But I think as a philosopher, what you then have to do is you then have to, when you've looked at it closely enough, you then have to switch. You have to switch to the power back on, and things have to start moving again, and you have to be able to keep track. It's almost like that. It's almost like the old shell game, where you've got the guy there with the 3 cups or the 3 shells on a table, and there's a ball underneath one of them. And he's moving these things around, and all you're doing is you're just focusing on the one cup, and you're keeping focus on that, because that's where the ball is. And then suddenly, when it stops, you're back in the world again, and you're having to look at that cup in the context of all the other cups on the table, and saying, okay, where is it? Where does it belong?
I find that,
and I think that's what
I find that with when I was studying philosophy, all different types of philosophy. I had to have that feeling when I'm taking in the ideas, that my rational, if I just turn on my rational brain, looking at the words, or listening and trying to think almost too hard, sometimes you have to let it wash over you, the ideas, and you have to your mind will grab it, go in there and grab it, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that and I'm not trying to create an apology for the comic genre or any other genre for that matter, but for me, that's one of the values of something like the comic genre for me. I mean, it could be the same for other people with I don't know, soap operas or poetry or Renaissance art or whatever. It's not just focused on that, but it is. You can read a comic, and in a sense, time kind of stops still. You're drawn into that particular world. You're drawn into the problems of that particular character. There are conflicts that are set up which help you focus on a particular issue or a particular concern, and you can just get carried away with the story while those ideas are flowing through your mind. And those ideas don't necessarily. I mean, you're not reading a comic and thinking just every time I read a comic, I'm not thinking, yes, well, of course, This speaks to the inauthenticity of human existence, or this over here talks about the kind of the binary nature of human identity. And so on. Doing that, I mean, you could do that, and if you're teaching it, maybe you will do that. All of these characters wear a lot of these characters wear masks, and it's always fascinating to me. The whole issue of masks and how we utilise masks and what masks do for us. But I'm not thinking about that when I'm reading Spider-Man particularly.
Well, that was actually...
It's only afterwards I reflect on that.
That was actually my next question, which I know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So,
well, you're a very clever man.
Well, it's obvious, really. But do you think Stan Lee and all the other artists, when they were writing these comic books, were aware of these, at least aware of like the kind of the big ideas that they were bringing to the fore?
It's yes. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, without talking to them personally, it's difficult to make a judgment. But personally, I would say yes. I mean, having heard interviews and so on, I'm coming at it from that point of view as well. But I think it's fairly obvious from the output. In the same way as, if you see a particular piece of fine art, or you read a particular piece of poetry, or listen to some music, you can have a sense in which you understand the creative process and perhaps what's motivated that process. Somebody produces a particular song, you think, oh well, this is somebody who knows what it was like to be in love, and to have had that taken away or to have lost that. Here is somebody who's painted a picture and clearly has a deep personal faith, or has an understanding of the nature of man's relationship with God, that sort of thing. And I'm convinced, comics evolved, even through the 60s they evolved from relatively straightforward conflicts with relatively straightforward villains to things that became more complex. But even the earliest ones, we mentioned the Fantastic Four. The first issue of Fantastic Four, and I read that again recently with my daughter. We went out and we had a little memorial to Stan Lee in a local bar, and we had a beer, and we read some of his early work. And the first story, there's Cold War politics involved in this, so there's a bit about kind of we must make it into space before the commies do. There's that kind of preparatory stuff just to set up the scene. Then you've got issues. They start exploring issues of pride and identity. Well, I'm not going to do this because it's all very dangerous. And Reed Richards says, "Oh, well, I know Sue Storm or something says, oh, to the pilot, oh, you afraid, And he said, "No, I'm not afraid of anything." So off they go, and. Once you get the basic origin story out of the way, and there's a MacGuffin there. It's always in the 60s. Always something to do with radiation. You get bombarded with radioactive rays or cosmic rays, or you get bitten by something radioactive. That's neither here nor there. I mean, it's just a kind of a mechanism. But then you get to the story where they there have been reports of monsters on an island. And they've been asked to go and investigate. They go to this island, and what you find at the heart of this, once you kick back all the monsters, is a guy who delights in the name of the Mole Man, living underground. And you think, oh yeah, the Mole Man. Oh yes, who's he? And they tell you his origin story, and his origin story is he looked a bit odd. And nobody would give him a job, and he was laughed at all the time, and girls wouldn't go out with him. And these are all portrayed in just like a montage of images, him, of a girl. Just a fantastic image of just him there and this girl just laughing at him. And you think as a kind of young lad, man, yeah, I've been there. I know what that's like. That's going to be my big. I mean, I wasn't dating women when I was in my primary school age, but there's that kind of burgeoning sort of how do you approach women when you feel kind of a bit kind of different. Everybody feels different when they're that age. How do you approach them? How are you going to get people to like you? What happens if people don't like you? And here's the Mole Man, and because he looked a bit odd, and he looked a bit short, and he looked a bit squinty. People just made fun of him, and so he left society. He just goes off into the wilds, and he ends up kind of disappearing down into this cave somewhere, and he makes friends with all the other outcasts, kind of the monsters and the freaks, and the other things that don't fit in. And he's quite a pathetic character in the literary sense. And that was Fantastic Four 1 in 1960. And Kirby, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were not just setting the Fantastic Four up against villain of the week, some kind of mighty powered kind of villain. They could have introduced like Doctor Doom first off, but no, they introduced the Mole Man,
sympathetic
somebody
character.
And it is, because you think, okay, and it makes it's very difficult to take a black and white view on this, because although the Mole Man is a villain in a sense that he wants to make people pay for making him suffer, you kind of get it, and I can remember reading this thinking, I don't know whether this is a bad guy or a good guy. And then that makes you start to think about people's motivations and whether good and bad really are kind of black and white issues. I don't suspect for a moment that I had that really pinned down in my kind of 8-year-old mind, what was going on or whatever. But it does raise it, I think it did start to kind of build up the sense that perception and motivation are really important, and you can't just say this is good and this is bad and this is right and this is wrong, without kind of going back and asking the difficult questions. Why is this happening? So the Mole Man, I mean, is a character that persists right the way through kind of the Fantastic Four's history. So, and most of the villains that turn up are all villains that have had kind of accidents or been snubbed in some way. I mean, even Doctor Doom, who's kind of Marvel's kind of villain par excellence, was treated badly. He came from like a gypsy background in Central Europe. His family were kind of killed and destroyed. His mother was kind of hounded out for being a witch. His father was killed for all kind. And there's an arrogance about him, because it's a protective thing. It's kind of, I am going to be better than all of this, and I'm going to make these people pay. I'm going to educate myself, and he's a genius. And for many years, he becomes the kind of the alternate, the other side, the true kind of anti-hero. You can kind of see where he's coming from. He has an accident which kind of scars his face, so he shuts himself off from the world in this kind of suit of armour. And says, okay, there will be no longer be Victor Von Doom. There will just be Doctor Doom, and the world just better watch out.